All right. So, I I wanted to talk to you because I've talked to. I mean, dude, I I remember you were on my panel and you said something like, um, whiteness can't be the answer for literally everything. And immediately my thought was like, oh well, it can be for Aiko, dude. That that is she. That's not gonna stop her. That is her answer for literally everything is
Okay.
whiteness. But then like sometimes I get into it with her about what it means, and like every time she says like, well, I'm using like a Joe Lewis definition, and like um we'll
My
but she does,
reputation precedes me.
yeah, but then she doesn't know how to like describe it, and just
Gotcha.
always says like, well, you just need to talk to Joe. My understanding of whiteness is mainly like, I know people don't like this term, but like it's more of like white culture or white things, the like the upper class of people who called themselves white, taking over, colonizing all over the place, to where the um, uh, people of color became minorities, and then were it was almost like a necessity for them to integrate, and it was almost like a cultural genocide on them. And then now, even hundreds of years later, it manifests itself pretty much as um, almost like white privilege, and
Hmm.
that this isn't necessarily something that like white people today are still actively pushing on purpose, or like consciously pushing on purpose, but more something that they're born into to continue perpetuating. And um and so yeah, that's the way that I understand it and
Okay.
explain it. And that's where her and I end up getting into it about.
Like back and forths about that type of stuff. Yeah.
Yes. So
Gotcha.
is there something that you disagree with there, that um
I can help maybe in terms of centering it a little bit.
mhm,
I think something that can happen a lot. I'm sure you run into this too, where it's not necessarily that everything needs to have simple definitions of describing things, but obviously there are ways that you can use things and define certain phenomena in a way that's like simple enough that's like digestible for people to understand. Because sometimes like it sounds like maybe a disagreement is that like the deck is kind of stacked in such a way where um, maybe there's a way that we can sort of like condense this so it's a bit more effective. Um, yeah, I usually the way that I describe whiteness is it's like a two-level thing. So whiteness at its core is just practices that produce white privilege. That's it.
I mean, that's, yeah, that's practically what I said. I didn't say
Yeah,
practices. I say white culture that's spread to a point to where white privilege exists.
gotcha. So the reason why I reduce whiteness is because there's a few caveats that have to be sort of tackled. So how about this? I'll lay out like part one to part two, and then I can give a little bit of the nitty gritty, right? So whiteness practices that produce white privilege, and then white privilege, and the way I explain it is the prioritization of the expectations, needs, and desires of white people. Now, the one thing that gets kind of lost in whiteness, in my opinion, is that a few things actually. The first thing is that anyone can participate in whiteness regardless of skin tone,
Mm-hmm.
and then whiteness is not an attack on white identity.
Yeah.
And those are like the two things that I think are. I understand why the second gets conflated, because when you have something that's called whiteness, the first connection I think people get is like, oh, it's about skin tone. It's like, hang on, like, does it involve something that results in skin tone at the end? Yes, but there's a bit more there that I think people can probably get on board on that are maybe on the fence for it, if that makes sense. Um, because when you start thinking about like the practices aren't necessarily things that are what's the word, that are very like tricky to understand or process. What I mean by that is there's certain just like practices and navigations in society that can lead to white privilege. Like one idea of white privilege is like setting low expectations for students in particular, like neighborhoods, groups, or what have you. As an example, like the practice in this regard would be the lessening of, for example, like, oh, like if these kids that come from X city, they're not really the best individuals. And it's like, okay, why are they not the best individuals? Well, it's because they live in this city and their schools are bad, and then like they don't have any fathers in the home, and then they can start stacking the deck in that regard. And it's like, hold on, like the privilege there, right? The expectation, need, or desire in that example is that you want people to not set low expectations for your children or for yourself based on where you live. That's, I would argue, is like a base expectation that people have.
I'm sorry.
And for a lot of, sorry, go for it.
When I maybe I missed
I
the part.
feel like I lost you. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was when it came to having two-parent households, you were saying that it's like uh what is it what that we're setting too low of expectations for Black Americans? What were you
No, no,
saying?
no. So, like to maybe center this example a little bit, the expectation here is that you don't want people to set arbitrary standards based on your living situation or where you live, right? Like you want people to treat like, okay, like this is my family, and I feel that like the expectation is that like people will respect my family like regardless of what the composition is.
Mm-hmm.
um and then the practice is the diminishing of certain familiar structures, or even just your living situation. Like, so one thing is like, because I would hear this a lot, is that, oh well, they don't have a father in their home. Like, and again, this isn't exclusive to Black Americans, by the way. Though, like you'll hear people say things like, oh, they don't have a father in the home, so no wonder they act this way, or no wonder why they have a hard time in school. Oh, they have a hard time in school because, or they have a hard time in like work, like because, oh, there's only one person at home, so of course they're having a hard time in school. It's like, hang on, like maybe there are things that have nothing to do with the home situation as to why that student is struggling, or why the individual is struggling. So the expectation is that nobody is setting arbitrary bars or expectations based on your neighborhood, your family structure, what have you. You just want people to treat you as who you are. So that's like the expectation. And where whiteness comes in, and the practice in that example, I would say, is the changing of standards and bars based on the understanding of people's lived experience. And by lived experience, I mean like their family structure and where they come from.
So,
And
what is the prescription there then to not talk about how people should have two-parent households?
no, no. So you can have conversations about like the outcomes of children based on like certain like home factors. Like you can talk about those things,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't want to always ascribe like it's not as easy to ascribe everybody's problems based on their family structures. My point.
Well, not
So
all of them,
yeah,
but I would say
right.
that like that's a big part of like I what I deal in mostly is rhetoric and like debate
Mm-hmm.
coaching and things like that. And when I talk to people about how they would talk to right wingers about systemic racism, I'm normally like 100% on talking to a right winger about systemic racism and them leaving that conversation saying, okay, yeah, I believe in systemic racism. And one of the things that right wingers talk a lot about is the family structure, having 2-parent households, how important this is, blah, blah, blah. And so if you can describe to them, like, yes, well, this is actually part of systemic racism. This is like one of the reasons that if somebody who grows up in if an African American is less likely to be born into a 2-parent household, then they are automatically disadvantaged or are automatically more likely to be disadvantaged, then we can all agree that, like, you know, there are systems or things out of their control that are making them more likely to be disadvantaged.
Right, and then the practice that would happen there, what I'm trying to lay out to maybe I can make it a bit more clear here, is that you don't want to immediately ascribe, because somebody is black, that they don't have 2 parents in the household. And like sometimes you'll hear kind of in language, especially in sports, where you'll see a situation where the interviewer might say something along the lines of, so it's like, so it must have been really hard for your mom, and it's like, it was really hard for both of my parents. It's like there's no, like, because sometimes you want people to inference things that they don't have any evidence of. Mm-hmm. So like, just because you see a black American doesn't mean that they don't have 2 parents in the household, that type of thing.
Right.
So, and then the privilege is that for most white Americans, I would argue, is that they don't have to, they don't get prescribed these certain types of, like, these unnecessary, what's it called? Preconceived notions. Mm-hmm. Because you kind of hear that sometimes in the language of like, well, the reason why they're looting and rioting is because they don't have fathers in the home. And it's like, well, wait a minute. There's plenty of people who are rioting and protesting over the past year who had both parents in the home. Right. So, like, why are we ascribing something that we have no proof or even like way to fabricate that exists?
Well, I mean, it goes a little bit farther than that, though, doesn't it? Because I recently saw a study that said that it's not just whether or not you grew up in a 2-parent household, but whether or not you grew up in a neighborhood or a community that had both father figures and mother figures within the community that you could attach to. So like if you were able to, like, if you grew up without a father, but you were able to play football and have that father figure, that male role model in your life, then like you still come away with that same advantage, and to where white communities are more likely to have both role models, and black communities are less likely to have them, to where it's not just about whether or not you have it in the household, but also within the community.
Yeah. Something else that another like pretty decent example that I give people when we're talking about like whiteness and how it becomes white privilege is just the idea of, like, I'm using schools as an example, right? The idea of just like holidays. So for white Americans, generally speaking, you don't have to worry about things being scheduled on dates of religious or cultural holidays. Mm-hmm. So what that looks like, a big example is Ramadan. Or even for Jewish Americans, when it comes to things like Yom Kippur, where I've had plenty of students where they've had Yom Kippur and then their school just didn't observe it as a holiday. And then like they would have something like an exam or something on that day. And it's like, okay, I can't go to this because I have Yom Kippur. And then I've seen teachers who just go like, well, I don't care. And it's like, no, you should care. Like there's, so for white Americans generally, they don't have to worry about having things, like the expectation, rather, I should say, is that you don't want to have things scheduled on important days of religious and cultural holidays. Mm-hmm. Like that's the expectation or desire, at least. And then the practice is not observing those religious or cultural holidays, which then leads to a group of individuals getting disproportionately targeted by that practice. And that can be something as simple as like Ramadan or Yom Kippur, or something a bit more tricky, like I can't think of it or something as tricky as I think it's called, like, there's certain prayers within Sunni and Shia Muslim faith where there's different prayers throughout the day. And one of the ones that one of my students runs into a lot because he gets a lot of problems in there is that there's a prayer in the middle of the day in the afternoon. So something that teachers would understand is that, okay, during this time he has to do this, and there's no like is, ands, or buts. It's not like can you finish your test and then go do it. It's like, no, it's like this is the time every single time. And some teachers would observe that and respect it, and some teachers wouldn't. And the expectation is like you want people to respect your faith no matter what the circumstances. Now, granted, obviously, there's when we're talking about white privilege, it's a prioritization, right? So you're going to run into situations where the prioritization is not met, because prioritization isn't a guarantee. It just means that like you're up front in the queue.
So here's where some of my community members will take an issue is that if we go to another country, like in Africa or in the Middle East, they will also have the same thing where they're not trying, where their scheduled days or holidays or things like that, those are not going to respect a Christian holiday or American holidays or things like that.
Sure.
But overall, this is going to be common no matter where we go, yet we call this whiteness when it's something that's going to be common in every country based on who the majority or what the majority race is in that country, right?
Yeah, the tricky thing when we're talking about privilege and the practice that produce privilege is that it's going to vary from area and area that you go to. The rub, and I think the reason why people kind of push back on sometimes, is that race in America is a very special thing that's different than in other countries. Excuse me. And race changes from country to country. Mm-hmm. Like what's considered, because you're knocking on that door, and I agree with you. It's like what's considered black in America may not be considered black in Brazil, which may not be considered black in Cuba, which may not be considered black, and maybe not the United Kingdom, it's not a good example, but may be considered black in Africa. And that's the kind of important distinction. And one of the reasons because of that is America did a very special job at creating, I wouldn't say creating, but making sure that race is something that's not only cemented within law, but cemented within just like practices of like, just like socialization and culture. And now, do I think it's a good thing? No. We want to get to a point where we don't have to worry about things like racial categorization or even like racialized identification. But unfortunately, in America, it's like it's baked into the fabric of society. Now, does that mean that America's racist? No, it's more that, because that was a weird thing that came up. I guess everybody was asking the same question at the same time, and every politician was giving their answer. Is that like race is just baked within America? It's part of the main dish. It's not a side course. But if we spend a bit more time trying to understand how it continues to perpetuate itself in society, then maybe in part on top of dealing with the laws, we can get to a point where we don't have to like be burdened or quote unquote burdened about like these conversations, where these conversations about race and the consequences of it can just be natural conversations that don't lead to people feeling like guilty or pushing back on just like historical context.
So again,
I think whiteness, white privilege is part of that. My point, like having better conversations around those two things.
So what is the prescription there again? Like when it comes to like holidays and things like that, because like you're a teacher, right? A school teacher. Like we already have issues with like too many days off a lot of the times, or like, a hurricane happens, we have to extend the school year when we're already trying to condense it. Like what is the prescription to fix something like that? Yeah,
so if I was to say for religious holidays and cultural holidays, is just observing them. That sounds like such a simple thing. But if a student comes to you and tells you like, hey, this is a holiday, like I can't make this because of like this is a holiday for my faith, then it's just like, okay, we'll find a way to make sure that you make up the work or something, whether it be make up the work or find another way for you to satisfy whatever requirement is for the class. Most schools already do this. It's very uncommon now where, I mean, not that it doesn't happen all the time, but it's very uncommon now that you'll have educators or even school districts that don't observe holidays that are outside of Christianity and Roman Catholicism or Catholicism generally. Catholicism has a bit more, especially Christianity, have a bit more of an upper hand only because the calendar is kind of built around these holidays. Whether that be, and it's really just the big two, like Easter and Christmas. They happen to fall on the day, like that happens, like for example, Christmas, that's just, they set that whole week aside as a quote unquote break. And then you get the really like the 23rd, depending on the school district, off. And then it's like 24, 25, then you get the whole week through New Year's. And then Easter is the same thing. Since Easter's on a Sunday, they pad it in such a way where you'll get maybe like off Easter weekend and then through that following week. Where in other religions, they don't have the comfortability to be able to fit within the school schedule. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or even get padding for a break. And again, like just so I'm clear, like the phenomenon of teachers not observing holidays, I don't want to say it's rare, but it's definitely way more rampant when I was growing up than what happened now. Like Yom Kippur was a holiday that my school district didn't really observe until I think my senior year. Mainly because in part, it always lands like in a weird part of the year. Because like in the middle of October, like early October, like late September, early October, depending on where it lands. Another one that I'm thinking of is like Passover. That tends to be another finicky one. It's usually that Friday, or I think it's like the Thursday or Friday. I remember off the top of my head. That tends to be kind of tricky, where some students don't even go to school that day. Some do. It's like a weird thing.
Okay.
And like I said, for the prescription, right, it's just making sure that we understand that like not everybody falls under Christianity and Catholicism, and that there's certain holidays, albeit they're not that many, that we have to be sure we observe and respect over the course of the year.
So, is it like for African Americans who are kind of building their own culture within the United States, is the goal to like mix everybody's cultures, or is it to keep separate cultures but have a way to where they're all somehow able to coexist?
Well, I'm always of the camp that we can have separate cultures and separate ways of expressing ourselves socially across the United States, and we already do this in a way. But the thing is that these communities, I would argue, there has to be a level of integrationalism that has to happen. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that you, I don't know how to word this thought in a way that makes sense, but does that mean that like you have to completely adopt certain things of other people's cultures? Absolutely not. But what that does mean is you still need to have a level of understanding and sensitivity, whether that be like cultural competence, when you're walking into those situations. Because the expectations are going to be different. Like if I go into there's a part of in North Jersey, up in Jersey City by Hoboken, closer to Jersey City side, a lot of what people would call literal gusanos migrated to the United States. And gusanos, generally speaking, even though it is people do consider it a slur, it's describing a very specific type of Cuban American or Cuban that migrated to the United States, mainly people who fled Castro. and there's like a high population of Cuban Americans now that live up there. Now, the expectations in that community are different. Like while you want to, or to a general idea, like most people, I would argue, speak English. In that community in Jersey City, it's Spanish. And when you walk into that community, because I had to deal with this, is that you just got to keep that in the back of your head at all times. That like you're not going to be met with people who know English in every given place that you interact with within that particular community. Does that mean that you cannot interact with that community? No. But if I was somebody who moved into that area, that's something that I have to think about. So what that looks like is that if I was living in that community as somebody who wasn't a Cuban American, I'd probably have to know Spanish. If I would want to like be able to interact with that community of people. And certain politicians know this, like Cory Booker tries Spanish. Is it the best thing in the world? No, but he understands that like for a lot of New Jerseyans, English might not be their primary language. So you got to like, as a senator who's representing the state, that's just something you gotta do. Which is why if we reverse it to like Ted Cruz, that's why for Ted Cruz resonates for a lot of Texans, because Ted Cruz is not your cookie cutter politician who is just like a quote unquote traditional American, if that makes sense. Like he's Spanish. I think I don't want to mischaracterize it, but like his full name is Rafael. It's Rafael Cruz. That's not a very American name, despite the fact on top of it, it's not a very Canadian name, especially because he was really from Canada. So I guess my point is that you can have communities, and that's totally fine, like communities of certain ethnic groups or certain racial groups, but then the problem is when those groups don't really interact with other groups within their community at large. And that's something that tends to, you run into problems. That could be something as simple as representatives not paying attention to that community of people because they don't know how, like they say, like quote unquote, don't know how to communicate with that community of people, or they might just get ignored by certain social policies because maybe people don't like understand like how the political system works. And what I mean by don't know how the political system works is that maybe they don't get the same type of resources to understand what happens in like township meetings, or like maybe don't have people who like want to push to run for a political office to represent themselves within their community, stuff like that. And sometimes communities need a bit more of like support in those regards because of those cultural differences.
So do you think, like, especially with the pushback that we get just based on the name from right-wingers, do you think that the name for Whiteness is rhetorically counteractive, and probably there could be like a better name for it or something that describes it in a better way? Or do you think it's necessary for people to understand like where it comes from and to continue using the same name?
Yeah, I think generally as is, it's fine. However, I think something that everybody could do a better job at is really being able to not necessarily define what they mean, but being able, if they can't define it, be able to really articulate what are the practices, like what is white privilege. Because at the end of the day, white privilege is just the prioritization of the needs and desires of white people. But if you take white people out of the equation, it's just the expectation, needs, and desires of people. Like, and you don't want to have a prioritization based on skin tone. So it's like, okay, like, well, why are people getting prioritized based on skin tone? And it's like, oh, there are certain practices that lead to that. So when people talk about like abolishing whiteness and eliminating whiteness, they're not talking about eliminating white people. It's talking about, okay, how do we get rid of these practices that produce the prioritization of expectations, needs, and desires based on skin tone? because like we want people just to be treated as individuals. So if we're striving towards that, then getting rid of practices that produce white privilege would be a good thing. The problem is that a lot of I would argue that a lot of the practices can be things that people might consider like, well, why? Like, I guess the cliche term is like, well, why does that matter? Like one I can definitely think of is using the term illegals to reference undocumented immigrants when there's already a term for that person, like these big people, like undocumented immigrants. And it's like, well, we gotta call them like it is, illegals. And it's like, no, the expectation here is that you don't want to be categorized just based on your ethnicity or your status. Like you don't want to be like a negative connotation to that. But something that people do, unironically, is they'll just call people who are from Mexico or have certain characteristics that might make you suggest that they are from Mexico or somewhere in South America, mainly if they just speak Spanish, as that, oh, they must be illegal because they don't speak English. And it's like, hang on, like English is not the primary language of the United States. It's a language that's spoken in the United States, but to ascribe that somebody speaks Spanish, therefore they're illegal, that's the practice. The practice is calling people illegals based on just characteristics as something as simple as speaking Spanish, when in reality, there's one, already a term, undocumented immigrants, and two, you can't just, like for white Americans, right? The expectation is that people don't assume your immigration status based on the language that you speak. So we shouldn't ascribe that to other people. So the elimination of the practice would be not calling people illegals based on the language that they speak. And now for some people, that might be a bridge too far. But I think we should at least try to eliminate some of these practices that we kind of do in our everyday life.
I mean, I don't have an issue with the term illegal. Now, yes, calling somebody an illegal just because they speak a different language, like, yeah, that's odd.
Right.
But like I somebody the other day, I think it was Frames, I believe, got upset with me for using the term illegal, and I thought he was joking. But like, he's like, they're literal people, don't call them illegals. And I'm like, yeah, but like, it's their literal person that is illegal. Like, it is their body that is illegal. So like, they are literally illegal. Like, they themselves are now illegal in this situation because their body has crossed the border. So I don't know.
You're talking within like, because they entered into the United States, an individual entered the United States the way that they did, therefore their status would be that they're living under or like entering into this country illegally.
Yeah, I'm saying it is their body that makes it illegal. It's not like just the action, but it's their body being in over the border illegally, which is what makes it illegal, which is what makes them illegals because they're
But you would agree though that like what I described, I think you did though, where it's like the idea that if somebody speaks Spanish, therefore they're illegal.
Right.
That's the thing I'm talking about here, where it's like because there's so many memes of, I don't want to say memes of that. There's just like many documented footage of individuals where they're at a gas station or something, they speak Spanish to their neighbor, to whoever's with them, and then you get somebody just like heckling them, and it's like, we don't like your kind here. It's like, wait, what?
Like, I was born here. What are you talking about? Yeah.
And to be as clear as possible, right? Like, we don't prescribe that. Like, the expectation is like, if I speak my language from like whether my ethnic origin is, people aren't going to consider me like second-class citizens or not part of this country. Where for Jewish Americans, that's not something. Well, giant asterisk and 30 pages of fine print, where like if a Jewish American speaks Hebrew to another Jewish American, there's no question of like, well, what's your citizenship? And it's like, American. What? And no different than like for Polish Americans if they speak Polish to each other, or Germans if they speak German to each other. Like, sure, there's like other types of like microaggressions and stuff that we can get into for sure, but on its face, like, the expectation is that Like, if I speak another language based on my ethnic origin, I'm not going to be questioned about my citizenship within the United States.
Right.
And like directly questioned.
So I guess something to clear stuff up for the chat a little bit is he's not saying to get rid of white culture. He's saying make it to where white culture is more accepting of other cultures and like more inviting, make it to where like they're more easily recognized, to where it's not just like a melting pot to eventually make them conform to our ideals, but to where they're able to keep their own ideals and live amongst the
right.
white people at the same time.
And the thing is too is that like there's going to be certain levels of I don't want to say assimilation, that might be the best word. There's certain types of integration when you live in a country that you're just going to have to do. And Americans, I would argue, understand this when they go abroad. Like if you are going to Germany and living in Germany, you're gonna have to learn German. Right. If you're gonna go to Japan and live in Japan, like you're going to have to learn Japanese. Now, granted, the United States is in a special case because you can live your entire life in the United States with not really having to know English fluently. But you can navigate through America with a basic understanding of English, and many Americans already do this. Now, the question is when you start prescribing that, like, you must do this in order to be considered a citizen here, where like no other country does that. Like, there's an understanding that, like, hey, if you learn this language, it can significantly help you, but if you don't, we're not going to like put these extra barriers so that you can't navigate in society.
I don't know. I get what you're saying, but I do think that there's a level of cohesion that is necessary.
Yes.
And that like people speaking the same language definitely helps to where we don't have as many like communication barriers and things like that. And in order for us to even like have conversations about being more accepting, we have to clear up those communication barriers first.
Right. And this is also why, like, of using schools as an example, this is why ESL exists, where like there's an understanding, like if you want to get through the school system in the United States, like you have to learn English. And not like, I'm not saying you have to learn English in a way that like you 100% like know it like the back of your hand. Like everybody's learning English in real time every single day, but enough to have a conversation just to get through to whether it's like the next step or just to understand what's going on in the classroom is a huge benefit. And that's something that educators understand, that like that's going to be a hurdle if you're going to be a teacher. Well, no, it's going to be a hurdle if you're going through the school system, excuse me. So they make sure that they're making a special effort to make sure that those students are being taken care of in that regard, because it's difficult for any teacher in America to have to like set aside or kind of like pay attention. Like, okay, this one student speaks Spanish in a classroom of 25 students. It's unrealistic for me to prioritize that much time on one student who doesn't know English very well. But in an isolated situation, like you can have specialized teachers who understand like, okay, like the problem isn't necessarily that they're bad at the subject, they just need a little bit more time with this language. So let's make a space for these students. And I'd argue for ESL that works really well.
So what would you say to somebody who says that like it sounds as though prioritizing American culture is whiteness? Is that do you think that would be an apt description?
I would say that there are certain, due to how society was constructed, there's certain things that people ascribe to what it means to be American. And I argue that one of the best things that America has is the fact that you can't really pin down what it means to be American. Like we have an idea, right? Like there's certain things, but as time is progressing, we're seeing that like being an American is much more it's on its face simple. Like there's certain things that like people ascribe, like whether it be like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, like all that good stuff. But there are certain things that kind of have to get weeded out first. And to its credit, it's a lot better, right? Like we don't have the Klan openly navigating in public anymore. That's a good thing. Has the Klan completely gone away in society? No, but the rhetoric does manifest itself in weird ways. This is why I think, or rather I get really nervous when people start talking about this idea of like spreading Western ideals across the world. And it's like, there's certain values that supersede all cultures and religions, and we must make sure as Americans that other people like get to see the benefits that I have. And it's like hang on, like let's not load the deck that much. Like there are, like just because that we think something is good might not be the best thing for all people across the world. And we see examples of that, whether that be Germany, Japan, Germany again, where there's like there are certain practices that might lead to bad outcomes for people across the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be the arbiters and deciders that we must stop X group and show them that this is the way that you should be ruling your people, or this is the way that you should be doing your society. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, so like when it comes to like what white culture is, right, and the idea of like I'm not advocating for the elimination of white culture. I love jogging, but and the only reason why I say it, like, well, the only reason why just because it's a meme, but it's a meme of the like a historical little joke. Nike was running and jogging was a suburban thing. And then Nike came to be of that, and then the whole thing of like pushing jogging in like suburbs and stuff like that. So that's why I argue that the closest thing that we have to white culture is like maybe jogging, if you had to start somewhere. But that's besides the point. Like no one's talking about eliminating what it means to be ethnically diverse as a white American, because every like white Americans, I would argue, depending on your community, there is a level of ethnic pride that's no one really has a problem with. Like we understand that, and you kind of hear it in practice, right? So people will say really quick, like, I'm not white, I'm Polish, or I'm not white, I'm Irish, or I'm not white, I'm Cuban. And it's like, yes, you can be two things at once. Like your racial categorization and your ethnic categorization in America are two separate things. Now, granted, one of those things is an arbitrary thing based on the color of your skin, and you don't want your outcomes to be predicated based specifically on that outcome.
So you're not somebody who would say that like being white isn't even a race or something like that, because that's something that I hear on a consistent basis, and like it fits literally all of the like descriptors we would use for race.
Yeah, well, because the thing is that, and maybe this is why people may say that, is that race came about due to colonial expansion, but it was because they used an arbitrary characteristic to consider themselves the norm across the world, or the attempt to be considered the norm across the world. It just so happened when they looked at themselves, and it's like, well, what do we use the marker as? And it's like, our skin color. And it's like, okay. And then it was just never challenged. And then I talk about this a lot. Like what we saw is that on its face, it was ambiguous. Like when it came to just like colonialization across the world, starting in Great Britain and Europe, and then spreading out in other parts of the world, is that it took a while for race to kind of become a thing. And that's why I always say like the way that it happened was just through laws and time. And then, because what happens is you have to start making exceptions to validate that there are actual differences. Because like you can't, it's like, okay, well, these people are different from us. It's like, well, what makes them different? Because they look like us. Well, look at their skin color. And it's like, oh, okay, that's something that I can see. So maybe there is a difference there. And then you start like stacking the deck of like, well, also because of their skin color, they're not as smart as us. Because when you look at us, we're all smart. And look at our skin color. And it's like, hang on, like as much as and we know this like in a practical sense, right? Like just because you're white doesn't mean that you're smart. Like look no further than I love Joe Rogan. Like because people say that it's like, well, people are just say, or not really say that, but like if we took our modern brains and looked towards like the justification of like why colonizers made these exceptions, it's like, wait, that's bullshit. Like, what are you talking about? Like, but because the differences that they observed, right, were not necessarily. It wasn't about race. It's just about like if you live in a certain area for long enough, your body will adapt in a way as a means of survival. Like the only reason why like you and I have different amounts of melanin is because like your ancestors were closer or farther from the equator than my ancestors. Quite literally it. and then in time, right, is that like even when they're looking to expand, again, I'm just saying colonizers very broadly here, is that like they created exceptions and then used the law to codify those exceptions. So then you would see that like, oh, like being black is different than being white. When in reality, when the Irish were brought over as indentured servants, they weren't thinking about like race or anything. But like, how do you make sure that two enslaved groups of people don't work together? You create laws that discourage you from participating with the other enslaved group of individuals. Despite the fact that on its face, an enslaved African and an indentured servant or like an indentured ethnic European, there's no real difference that they can like codify because they're both doing like similar work. But if you work together, like I use the example of the Bacon's Rebellion, like the punishments on the same action were completely different. And the example I give is that all of the ethnic Europeans who participated in the Bacon's Rebellion were pardoned, but not the Africans. It's like, right. So, and then there were laws created to prevent that type of integration. Because like, while on its face, it has nothing to do with race, but you create exceptions so that people can kind of see that. And then like another example I give is that like, okay, like colonizers wanted to teach their religion to their slaves. But the Bible doesn't really cover slavery very well. And so you have to create exceptions because then like the question comes up of like, okay, if you can a person who is Christian be a slave? And then they made a law for that where like your religious status doesn't change your slave status. And it's like, okay, like that's another way of codifying it through law. And then over time, that's how we saw the idea of like Christian, white, and it's like of white skin tone and free were essentially synonymous with each other. And then with those differences, then you can make like certain understandings of like who's who and what's what. Like another example I can give in terms of Creoles. Because one thing that got codified through the law, and again, this is like a practice that produces white privilege, right? As an American living in the antebellum South, like basically the law worked like if you were a person of color, you could get stopped and there's no way to tell that you're a free person. But the way that they checked was to check your parents. So they would be like, who's your mother? Like, show me your mother. And it's like, okay, she's over there. And then they go up to her and it's like, is this your child? And then if they're white, you're good. If you're black, you're fucked. So, and that's like a practice where if you're a white American living in the antebellum South, like you don't have to worry about officers stopping you to confirm that you are a free person. I'm like, let me see your free papers. Like, no, I'm like, I don't need to show you my free papers. I'm white. But then for Creoles, and then when I'm saying Creoles, specifically TLDR French Americans who had children that were also African, so biracial essentially. That was something they had to worry about. And despite the fact that their social status was significantly higher than enslaved Africans and even free persons, but it's still something they had to worry about. Despite the fact that it was made very, very clear that there was a difference from being Creole and being, whether it be a free person in the post during Reconstruction. You know what I'm saying? Like, my point is that we created these exceptions over time, and then now we're kind of dealing with the consequences. We're not really dealing with the consequences, but we get like a lot of the residual effects of it, which I think are important to observe and try to like get over and tackle.
Okay, I gotta respond to my chat real quick. Okay, so what he's explaining is he's just saying that having a culture based around a race can exclude people very easily. And all we want to do is to make it to where they don't feel so excluded so naturally. And so, like, you guys say, like, oh, all he's doing is describing racism. This isn't racism, like, especially not explicit racism, because nobody's doing these things on purpose. It's just the fact that, like, in America, we do want to have, like, a melting pot of cultures. But because white people are the majority and our white culture has become the norm, it now becomes what's expected. It becomes like exactly like what when somebody does something different than white culture, then they're doing the weird thing. And
when in reality it's like it's not necessarily people are doing the weird thing. It's just that everybody in America is going to have different experiences based on who they are and where they've come from.
Right.
And that was like the whole experiment of America, where we're one of the few countries of people where we have other places that we've come from, where it's like, okay, you are American, but then there's also an entire lineage of people where you could come from anywhere, really. Like, even from, like, if I use my mother as an example, she was German, and she was Irish, and my father's German. So, and they have a whole lineage that dates all the way back to pre-colonialism, and they're able to track that. And it's like, okay, like, this is exactly when, like, my family immigrated to this country. This is exactly when your family immigrated to this country. And then we had generations where we built up wealth and other types of things. So while our endpoint and our children are American, our lineage comes from other places around the world. And while I'm not saying that isn't true for anywhere else in the world, but America is a very special thing because we are the new kids on the block. When it comes to, like, we didn't just, for a lot of reasons, obviously, that, like, we didn't, like, if America was set to evolve, I don't want to say evolve, it's not the best word, to just kind of be what it is, it would look vastly different without European, I'm using that term very loosely, but colonial influence. Like, we'd probably be speaking way more Spanish than for a lot of parts of this whole region. We'd also probably have a lot more, unironically, indigenous folks, where, like, it would look totally different. The makeup would be entirely different. But because of colonialism, like, it's an entire melting pot for the entire world. Is that a good thing? Depends on who you ask. I'm of the camp of, like, yeah, it's a good thing, but a lot of really bad, because of not treating people like humans, came about this thing. So, like, as people living now, it's like, okay, what can we do to make sure that we don't repeat the patterns of behavior that led to poor outcomes for people because of them treated as second-class citizens or not even citizens at all? I don't know if that made any goddamn sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And again, like, an example is, like, look no further than the Constitution. Like, the whole exceptions that they made about free persons is wild. because I would argue like one of the biggest sins for America is not acknowledging slavery and not answering the question of, are Africans people? Are enslaved people people? We made a lot of exceptions to be like, well, hang on, like they are, but not for the reasons that I want them to be. If you're in the South, it's like, hey, I want my slaves to count because they're my property. And it's like, okay, that's a take you can have. And then the North is like, I don't want your slaves to count as people, but they are people. What? So like, and then it creates like weird, except obviously it came to like the three fifths clause and a bunch of other stuff, right? Again, race fuck shit up. Like that's the probably the biggest takeaway I've always had when talking about race in America is that we did a very good job at not tackling these problems, and now we're just basically dealing with everybody else's garbage in terms of like just unpacking this.
Yeah, because like it's something I don't know that like I get into all the time is like where people think there's this like essential thing to your biology that will make you one race or another in the way that we categorize it today. And there's just not. Like, we look at somebody and we say you are this race based on the way that I look at you and the way that like I categorize you, which is why like Jewish people are considered white now, because like it's hard to differentiate them from white Americans because we're also I can't think of the word, like intermixed, to where like it's hard to tell, like before where you could tell Irish people from Italians and Italians from, you know, any other European sort of look. Like that's nowadays that's just not possible. So we just look at you and say, okay, like you're white, you're black, you're Asian, you're Middle Eastern, like.
And then what happens is we see this kind of come ahead with sort of black sentiment, or like black racism, like black anti-Semitism and Jewish racism, when in reality, like the core of my argument is that Jewish Americans were very, God, I mean, be careful when I say this, but I don't really have to be careful because it's not really that controversial of a statement. Jewish Americans became a very good proxy for all of the problems with the systems in America, without understanding that like there's a reason why Jewish Americans ended up in the fields and professions that they did. That does not mean at all that Jewish Americans are trying to take over the world. Like that, it's just nonsensical.
Yeah, I've talked about why they've ended up in their professions.
Yeah, because then what happens is you'll hear it manifest in people's rhetoric where people say like, Jews control everything, and it's like, no, they don't. You could say, as I'm gonna use the big band era as an example, right? You can say that there's a lot of Jewish band leaders during the big band era of jazz, but to say that Jewish people own big band music, it's like, no, like just because you have a high population of X individual in a group, like in a particular profession, doesn't mean that group controls that industry. And what happens is like all the critiques of like basically like when you're trying to identify who your oppressor is, of course you want people who are ethnic minorities to argue with each other about who controls more. Like that's the perfect thing if you want people to not ever deal with the problems of capitalism. Like you want the people underneath you just to infight with each other. So like as like it sounds like really conspiratorial, but it's like as those in power continue to do what they do, and they just watch Jewish Americans and Black Americans fight with each other and go full conspiracy on each other, it's like, okay, that's cool. They can do. They don't care. We'll just do our thing. They'll continue to fight with each other, and we're just going to continue doing what we're doing. Because it's very easy to point the finger at Jewish Americans when in reality it's really capitalism that is the actual fight. And if those two groups came together and fought against capitalism, then maybe we'll have good outcomes. But if they want to keep infighting, let them infight. A good documentary, really a documentary, to talk from Herzak News, kind of lays out what I'm talking about, where they basically sat black Americans and Jewish Americans together just to talk about the two things I described. And one individual brought basically what I was talking about, where it's like, we're probably on the same side about a lot of these things, but because of the perpetuation of anti-Semitism and racism that exists on like both sides on different levels, we're leading to this point where we're just infighting with each other. When in reality, like, there's somebody else who's like, the reason why we're infighting is because we understand that there's like critiques of the system. So why don't we just critique the system and work together, as opposed to fighting with us or fighting with each other and being super conspiratorial.
Yeah. I mean, I personally like capitalism, but I think that there are like holes in capitalism that we can fill with regulation. And
yeah.
I talked about this earlier. Yeah. Like I find it very common with people who consider themselves like hardcore capitalists, but they will use a lot of socialist rhetoric. And then when you tell them, like, you're using like all socialist talking points, like your problem here isn't, big pharma being unethical or, or that your boss needs to be a nicer person and give you more days off. Like, your problem is capitalism. Like, that's essentially just your issue.
Yeah, I'm always in the camp of like, in order to play the game, you're going to need some level of social and political power. And the only way to get that is with capital. Now, what you do when you earn that capital is incredibly important. Like I want money to survive and make sure if I have kids, they're taken care of. But then the question is like, how much is enough? And then what am I doing with that excess? And that's where I think people get kind of lost in the weeds. Where like we get those individuals on the fringe ends, like the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos, who acquire so much money that, like, even if, or not really necessarily money, but so much capital that I would argue they probably wouldn't know what to do with it if they had an entire lifetime. But then you have individuals who are like, they make enough so that them and those around them are taken care of, and maybe they're able to donate to certain causes that they feel are just. And I think that's okay. Like what you do with your social and political capital through the acquisition of capital I think says a lot about your character. Now, does that mean, like, can people use it in nefarious ways? Obviously. And those are the individuals and the things that we have to make sure that we properly identify. It sounds like I'm shilling for capitalism here, but my point is that, like, in order to play the game, you got to play by the rules. And while I understand that, like, it's a hard pill to swallow for that, but it's something that you got to do. Like, as you acquire capital, like, remember like what your desires and your end game is, and just like use that as your guiding force to know like when's enough and what's enough.
Anybody in the chat has any questions, yo?
I mean, it is attractive though, like the idea. I'm gonna Scrooge McDuck in some coins, but yeah. Or I mean, that'd be cool. Just have a room full of just like acquired wealth. But at the same time, it's probably not worth it. Yeah, it's like probably secure it to an extent that's a little bit too excessive.
I mean, I think people look at, the Elon Musks though and say like, well, this is unethical to even acquire that much money. And my point is like, well, this is like capitalism. Like the incentives are everywhere. And
Yeah.
Actually, that brings me to another point. I think that like this is a reductive point a lot of times when we look at like black culture and we want to be critical of things within black culture that could be toxic. Yet when a like a Republican or somebody like that says something stupid, we all just want to go off about how they're racist and horrible people instead of looking at the systemic structures um, that would incentivize these sorts of ideas and actions and influence them in the way that they do.
Yeah, I'm of the camp where, and my community knows it very well, where I don't use racist, sexist, phobic. I don't use those isms anymore. Like I use them when it's appropriate to properly identify what you're looking at. So like as an example, like I might say something on the lines of like, well, that statement wasn't racist, but it definitely involved race. And then it's like, okay, let's break down like why someone might think this is racist, why someone might think it's not. And then because a lot of times like can you have, I'm only speaking in terms of like social outcomes, because there are examples of people who do overtly racist things. And so it's like their intent is racialized and their impact is racialized. But then you might have something where their intent isn't necessarily racialized, but their impact is. And what tends to happen is when we're talking about racism, people want a very sort of fixed definition of like what that means. When if we understand that like race is not in America, it's a feature, it's not a glitch, then we have to know that like that practice is going to change based on what systems you're looking at. Like political racism is going to be totally different than interpersonal racism. And then like interpersonal racism is going to be totally different than economic racism. Yeah. And then what happens is people will start being like, well, there's too many definitions. And it's like, yeah, it's a fickle being, isn't it?
Yeah, like, this is exactly what I was talking about earlier. We were watching a video where a girl was talking about how like there's no such thing as racism towards white people. And I was like, this is an incredibly reductive take, because like she's going to disregard like all of like these interpersonal racist sorts of things, or these implicit sorts of racism, and explicit, like there's so many different kinds, to where she's probably gonna dumb it down to like power plus prejudice equals racism. And she did. That's exactly what she did.
Right.
And I was like, it's just like it's obviously like not as big of a deal, but like for somebody like me, I grew up in an all black neighborhood, and like my schools were all black, and like for me, experiencing racism is just like it is for any other minority, where you're the one who's different. The difference is that like I end up growing up to be just like a regular white man in America, and I eventually get past that where everybody else doesn't. But in the moment, when you're a kid, or like when you're, as an individual, that's not how you think of it. That's not how you like internalize these things. And to just
and I understand
say that like,
the
it
sentiment
doesn't exist is I feel like is horribly reductive.
Yeah, I understand like the sentiment and where that comes from, right? And I think that's an important thing. Like hearing somebody's argument, asking the question of like, okay, how can I reinforce this? And then like, what are the problems that exist within that reinforcement? Like the example of like black people can't be racist, they can be prejudiced, and it's like, hang on, there's something else there. Like there's an understanding that black Americans can absolutely be racist. Now, we can acknowledge that the experience that black Americans have towards white people it's a different experience. a different phenomenon, just like historically and culturally. Now, then that's where things are kind of weird, where you run into those arguments of like, well, it's because of systemic issues. Black Americans don't have the same type of political and social capital that white Americans tend to have. So when a white American does a transgression when a black American does a transgression towards a white American, the white American can just kind of like shrug it off, like, all right,
yeah,
which is a true thing. Like, yeah. and that's because like some of my friends do that, where it's like, I have one friend. I tell him all the time, there's gonna be a situation where I will not be able to save you, and what that looks like is that he'll like get into back and forths with he'll be arguing with somebody, and then he'll say something where it's like, I'm too white to have this argument, like, and just sits down and just drops it. And even there's a joke in the Boondocks of that very same thing, where like an individual like rubs up against a white person and it's like, watch where you're walking, and he turns around and it's like, hey, wait, like he's about to get into an argument, and he's like, wait a minute, I'm white. And then he just walks away. And it's like, that's a true phenomenon where like black Americans can say hateful things to white Americans, and white Americans can just be like, okay, and like, is there anything else you'd like to do to waste your time with me today? But does that mean, is that right? Like, but then the question is like, hang on, just because the impact doesn't line up, doesn't necessarily mean that like it's still not like it's a discriminatory act and stuff like that. Like, it's still discriminatory at its base level. Like, even if you don't agree with it, if you run into somebody who doesn't believe that black Americans can be racist towards white people, you can at least get them on the level of just understanding that what the action that they might describe is discriminatory, and we have to make sure that we, at the very least, call that part out. Because I've seen black Americans be racist all the time. It's just something I've seen. I think everybody's seen different examples of that. And then the question is like, does it meet the same type of impact that a white American can do, like taken to their logical extremes, right? Because like the logical extreme of, for a white American to be racist to a black American, I would argue, unironically, is put a white hood on and then go on and then like take a torch and have at it. Where for black Americans, there isn't a hate group that you can join up that's trying to go after whitey. Like, that doesn't exist. Right. And even if it did, I would argue that the United States government would be like, hey, we're going to make sure that doesn't exist, all right? Like, we got you guys.
They've done that before, where they've labeled groups as such, just to make sure that they got rid of them. So yeah,
or even like a Black Panther Party is a great example of that, where like the rhetoric around it, just because it's just black Americans with guns, it's like they're trying to take over and start a revolution, and it's like, no. But the thing is, like, I'm sure you see it, is that, I mean this in the nicest way possible, when it comes to white or anti-black sentiment for white Americans, they didn't really do themselves any favors when it came to the level, like the peak atrocities of hate crimes. That makes sense. Because I think what happens is, like, people will see like a group that's talks in a way that might be sort of like, you can say, like white supremacist adjacent, but then like what happens is people are very quick to go like, oh, they want an ethno state, and it's like, not necessarily. Like, because then like, and then when you hear their arguments, people will say things like, well, they're just coding it just so that they can appease like the masses, and it's like, are you sure about that? Or are you just inferring that because we had decades worth of rhetoric from white supremacists and nationalists coding their rhetoric to gain political power and stuff like that?
Yep.
Because like that was the same thing that happened with Black Panther. It was like, are you a group of hate? And it's like, no. And then it's still like, well, they said no here, but that does it really mean no? And it's like, what? Like, we should probably judge groups based on their actions and not necessarily like what they let me rephrase this.
No,
You
yeah,
wanna-
no, that's I mean
yeah.
that's exactly right. We should
Yeah.
judge them based on what they do, not what they say they do or what they say they aim to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, granted, like I'm not gonna give Eldridge Cleaver any any like charitability here because he was somebody who was very overt about the actions that should be done towards other American or no, to like people who are in political power structures. But then also he was exiled from the Panther Party. So it's like, and one of the reasons was because they argued that his rhetoric and his rhetoric around that was just way too extreme and not something that is like reflective of what the party's about, which then created like all this other side stuff. But that's another historical rant for another day.
Crap. Okay, I didn't realize how far we went over. All right, let me let's check some of these questions real quick. I wasn't even paying attention, man. I was just going. All right.
It'd be like that.
Let's see. So we got what does Joe think about Canada's mosaic versus the U.S. melting pot?
Canada's mosaic. That's the first time I heard that SAT word. I'm going to use the Google machine.
Yeah, I don't know.
Canada mosaic. Or cultural mosaic, the mix of ethnic groups, languages, and cultures that coexist within society. The idea of a cultural mosaic is intended to suggest a form of multiculturalism. Okay, different from other systems, such as the melting pot, that's often described like the United States assimilation. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I guess, what I'm describing here, is that like we need to have like an understanding of different cultures and cultural competency to be able to navigate around them. What makes America especially weird is that we're really far from maybe reaching a point of that. But it's bizarre because World War II kind of showed us that we need to interact with each other. And what level of interaction remains to be seen.
Not with Canadians, though. Like, Canadians are just inherently dumb. And, you know,
yeah, they're doing their thing.
People,
Poutine's pretty good. Yeah, I think that's a good. I think it's a good thing to understand that like there's different like to take this definition literally. Like there are different ethnic groups, languages, and cultures that exist within America, and that they should probably and should coexist with each other. Because at the end of the day, like although we come from, but then like it's like although we come from different places, we're still Americans, and our cultures matter, but we still got to work together. Like so, let's try to do that, please.
All right, that question was from Sassafras. I think there was one more. Wouldn't the prioritization of wants and desires of white people kind of define white culture?
Oh no. The thing that I try to make sure that I stress, and maybe I didn't make it clear, is that the prioritization, or rather, let me pull it back a little bit. So the way I described white privilege was the prioritization of the expectation, needs, and desires of white people. But if you pull this out, or like if you really like pull this definition apart a bit, everybody has different expectation, needs, and desires that have nothing to do with them being white. And my argument is that we have to try our best to make sure that people's expectation, needs, and desires are just met universally, regardless of their skin tone. However, there are practices in society that lead to the prioritization of the expectation, needs, and desires of just exclusively white people. And that's the thing that we got to avoid. Like we have to understand that like, okay, these expectation, needs, and desires are things that we all have, but we have to make sure that the practices in society are equally applied. So like another example I could give very quickly is just the expectation that somebody will pronounce your name properly. And then if you correct them, if they mispronounce it and you correct them, they will do the best of their ability to try to get your name right. And something that could be a practice that leads to white privilege is ignoring how somebody corrects you and just continuing to mispronounce their name, or say like, oh, that name is too hard, so I'm going to call you this instead. Not them telling you, oh, you're not really having a good job with this pronunciation of my name. You can just call me this instead. Right. They'll say something like, no, I'm going to call you this instead.
Yep.
Which is something that not to go back to the school system, but teachers would do that. We're like, I'm just going to call you the part of your name that I can pronounce. And it's like, hang on, there's like another name that I use that's like my nickname, so just use that instead. Because I've seen teachers do that a lot, which is really, really annoying. When in reality, like, you want the expectation, or really the desire, I should say, is that people will try their best to get your name right. And for white Americans, it tends to be that it's prioritized, that the prioritization for that desire is not exclusively, but for white people instead of all people. So the way that you can eliminate the practice is just being more conscious and dedicated to getting people's names right, which I think for most people is a pretty easy thing to do in their day-to-day, which is going to be hard, especially considering if we understand that the American language kind of sucks when it comes to understanding non-Western centered names. Like, really hard. And there's also other barriers, like as an example, I can't roll R's. Yes. So it's like, now, do I make every attempt to try? Absolutely.
Sure.
And I think for most people, they just want people to try. And then, like, if you can't, maybe there's like a conversation you could have, like, is like, do you have a nickname that you use? And instead, like, I don't want to butcher your name every time, but you give the agency to that individual to make that determination. So it's like, oh, you can call me this, or it's okay, like, you're trying. And that's the best you can, and that's all I care. Like, I care that you're trying, as opposed to, I'm just going to call you this instead, or abbreviate. Like, I'm going to say abbreviate, like, unnecessarily abbreviate. And then it's just kind of accepted, where it's like, hang on, like, you know what I'm saying? So to get back to the question, like, the prioritization is a prioritization of the things that lead to it being white people. Not that it's not that white people have separate expectation, needs, and desires that are different from other racial groups. It's the understanding that, like, because of these actions, it leads to the prioritization towards this racial group, when we want to just get rid of those practices that lead to that prioritization.
True.
Which is more like a social prescription than anything else. You can fix the laws too, but that's another very important thing. But
all right, Joe, I appreciate you coming on, man.
Yeah, this is a chill hang. I talk a lot. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, that's what I asked you to come do. So that's
yeah.
You did your thing. I appreciate it.
And something, I guess, is a little like takeaway thought that I tend to have is when it comes to understanding, like, what the expectations are, right? Is just asking the question of, like, what are my personal expectations? What are my personal needs? And what are my personal desires? And where do I think those exist for all people? And then, like, breaking it down from there of, like, okay, what are some practices that could lead to people being excluded from this particular need or from this particular desire? And that's a pretty good exercise to do. Because like, one of the things is that, like, seeing it in the wild, like, you might not even know what's happening. It sounds so, like, weird and dog whistly, but it's like you might literally, like, do something that's just that practice in real time, but it's like hang on, like, how do I flip that script? And it sounds like that weird, like, Marxist-Leninist indoctrination, but it's like, no, it's just, let's identify what these things are. Let's identify what the practices could be that lead to that thing. And that could lead to a good exercise in terms of, like, understanding what whiteness is and how whiteness can become white privilege. And then it's like, okay, how do we eliminate these practices? Like, that's all I'm asking for. Like, I don't think it's possible to get rid of white privilege, but I think it's possible that we can get rid of the practices that lead to white privilege. And I think that's a much easier thing for most people from a day-to-day basis, at least to try to do.
Awesome, dude.
Yeah, man.
All right. We're going to go watch Mortal Kombat if you want to come with us.
Yeah. Let me wrap here. I'll call my girlfriend to make sure she got home okay. She has this thing from time to time where she just like takes an Uber home and then doesn't text me back. So she's probably sleeping, but I'll see what's up.
All right, man.
Sure. All right, man. Yeah, see you soon.
We'll be in Twitch Politics. What was it? Chit Chat 2, I believe.
Sure. Okay. All right, yeah, for sure.
Later, dude.
All right, man. Later.
I was gonna go on to like ask you guys to see if you guys had any more questions, because I felt like there was a lot of misunderstanding where you guys kept acting as though he was saying let's abolish white culture, and he wasn't saying that whatsoever. So in my honest opinion, he articulated his idea better than I had heard it in the past, but I'm still left disagreeing with him. Okay. All right, let me switch over to Chit Chat 2, and then I will send you guys, or actually, I will put the link for Chit Chat 2 in my Discord.